I think it's fair to say that Peter Watkins never made a film as genuinely disturbing and effective as Punishment Park. It's a film that really lives up to its title, and it's a film that, like the person behind its creation, never really got the attention that it deserved. Despite this, one could argue it to be one of the most powerful protest films ever made, and the fact that it's not really garnered that large of a cult following seems unfair, especially as it's a film that has seemingly been relegated to the cold shoulder of history by the very people it sets out to expose. Released in 1970, Punishment Park is a pseudo-documentary made at the height of the growing conflict surrounding the Vietnam War in America. We follow two groups of dissidents, Group 637 and 638, who've been brought before a tribunal of conservative community members. Made up of members of the anti-war movement, civil rights movement, feminist movement, and various Communist Party members, the two groups are detained under the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1950, which authorises federal authorities, without reference to Congress, to detain persons judged to be a risk to internal security. The McCarran Act, nicknamed the Concentration Camp Bill by its detractors, was a federal law that, though never used in this fashion, was indicative of the kind of liberties taken with personal freedoms during the McCarthy era. So what we basically get as our initial setup here is an opportunity for the counterculture to argue their various points against the establishment. And it's in these scenes that the film's director is given a full chance to indulge his concept. But let me back up a little bit here first. To really understand this film, you've got to be aware of the kind of filmmaker Watkins is, his use of the medium to display his politics, and his intent to provoke a very visceral reaction from his audience. Firstly, Watkins, the filmmaker, had been consistently using the medium as an instrument of social critique, and would go on to produce all of his films with a docudrama style that I imagine he learned while he was working his way up the ranks making short documentaries for the BBC. He began his career in earnest in 1964 with the release of Culloden and then The War Game in '66, the latter a film that utilises the format of news magazine programmes documenting the aftermath of a nuclear strike against the UK. It was deemed too disturbing to broadcast on TV, but it would go on to win an Academy Award for Best Documentary and would finally be shown in the late 1980s. This was Watkins in the role of political provocateur, and it would be a role he would play for the rest of his career, leading to much of his filmography being neglected or marginalised. Hell, even his attempt at historical biography in the form of his 1974 film Edvard Munch, that's the guy who painted this, utilises large groups of non-professional actors, fourth wall breaking, and a cinema verite shooting style. Watkins decided to leave the UK after the poor reception of his first theatrically released film Privilege in 1967. And it was here that he returned to overtly political filmmaking, and so this finally is what leads us into Punishment Park. Now I want to get away from subtextual reading momentarily. I want to talk about how this film gradually increases tension, and how in its last act it turns into an exercise in outright escalation. In a 1967 interview with Roger Ebert, Watkins goes into detail about why he uses such an abrasive visual style, explaining he wants to make the audience believe they are watching something that's happening in that moment, instead of a traditional narrative film. And if there's anything from his filmography that really achieves this, it's Punishment Park. The visuals, combined with narration from Watkins himself using a cold, enunciated voice that is at first at a distance but gradually becomes more and more emotional as the body count rises, gives a grounding for our place as subjective spectators. It becomes apparent later on that the film itself is being made in the hopes of exposing the deadly consequences of the cops and later National Guard's trigger-happy antics in the field. So you could say that our emotional reaction to what's on screen is indicative of how far we will allow ourselves to be complicit in the brutality the two groups are faced with. Watkins himself described his films as an attempt at revolution, and what's interesting is how he uses the purest technical aspects of cinema to get his messages across. I believe the cinema verite style he adopts here is really appropriate for the subject matter and era, as the public was becoming more and more desensitised to the harsh realities of the war in Vietnam, with grainy 16mm footage of the conflict showing tremendous amounts of violence every night on the evening news. This culture of violence would go on to inspire filmmakers such as Wes Craven and Tobe Hooper to employ similar guerrilla filmmaking techniques to craft horror grounded in the disturbing potential for violence found in the most ordinary of American settings. As in both of the films shown here, the setting becomes a part of the conflict, with the narrator keeping track of the rising temperatures in the desert, and the two groups expecting water supplies at the halfway point only to discover that they've been lied to by the cops. The desert remains ambivalent and unforgiving. The visceral display of hardships endured by the characters humanises them even more. They slowly unravel as they become more disoriented and dehydrated. Eventually the groups begin to split into fractions, with some choosing to stay in one spot and wait to be arrested, while one couple go as far as to kill one of the cops, steal his shotgun, and make a break for it. The couple are subsequently hunted down by the other deputies, who are more than happy to have crossed the line between spectatorship and active participation. Watkins begins to emphasise the sport of the situation, calling back to classic Manhunter stories such as The Most Dangerous Game. Later, the narrator appears to be interviewing the couple, asking of their intentions from here on out, and we get a brilliantly cross-cut sequence that shows them explaining how their actions from here on out are revolutionary. They're either going to die or they're going to win. This is played out against the aforementioned deputy explaining how the line has been crossed, as well as the aftermath of one of the trials, with jury members deriding the actions of America's youth. They mock them, calling them naive, and say that they don't understand the nature of what's going on in their own country, and that their ignorance is going to lead them to violence. Watkins never hammers his point home too blatantly, and his clever use of temporal distortion here gives us a great chance to visibly see the hypocrisy of the establishment and how its assumption of the dissident far-left youth revolution is gradually becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Speaking of the cross-cutting technique, I think it's interesting how Watkins uses non-diegetic dialogue to reveal the intention behind some of the things the characters say. Often, we see a character explain a point, and then see the direct result of it play out simultaneously in the desert. The violence that unfolds later begins to seem inevitable. This leads me to what I think is probably the most disturbing scene in the film. Again, cross-cutting is used to show how hopeless the situation feels. The shooting starts. Some members submit while others begin to throw rocks. One of the characters, who up until now has been the most level-headed so far, explains how you only have one option left after you choose the path of violence or non-violence. Later, the narrator interrogates one of the National Guardsmen. He looks about 17 and is in shock at just having killed someone. Though I think Watkins' main concern was producing something in the vein of a socially conscious thriller, which, while not only relevant to a lot of the issues we still seem to be facing both in the States and here in the UK, it could be considered an early example of the kind of social horror films of Jordan Peele or Daniel Goldhaber. Though I feel horror for the most part has always been a reactionary medium anyway, used as a mirror to display societal fears played out to their natural conclusions. Just look at the Japanese monster movies of the 1950s. The original Godzilla movie is a fucking masterpiece, and the 98 one, I think is still really good. No one else likes that, but I like that one. I think the sensationalist nature of Punishment Park is probably the aspect that's criticised most often, and I do think it is sensationalist. That being said, I do think that the theatricality shown gives the second half added emotional resonance, and is used with enough intent to justify it. How Watkins embraces the non-linear editing style, use of temporal distortion, and a minimalist but still present soundtrack is incredibly effective, and by the last conflict, with the reveal that the end goal was never really achievable and the surviving characters have most likely been killed, the stylistic choices of the film will not just have affected you in a way as to make you feel empathy for the characters, but on a level which is directly linked to the reptilian need to survive. And in an era still so blatantly defined by social unrest, Punishment Park remains more relevant now than ever.